Hello everybody, this is going to be a controversial video unleashed on the internet. We have to talk about religion. I make no secret that, on my channel at least, that I'm an anarchist atheist. So my views on hierarchy of all types, religious or secular, I'm against. Now, when people trying to justify religion, regardless of their political position, there are religious anarchists and there are religious fascists. So, and everything in between. So we cannot ignore the fact they exist. But in many cases, many of these believers, regardless of the religion in question, or regardless what type of theism they subscribe to, we can't ignore the fact that religion has developed in a very anti-intellectual nature and its origins, and did it become intellectual or trying to change its theological foundation after the first generation basically died off. So in this video, we gotta talk about three topics. One is literalism. Is it new or it's been around way before that? Two, religion and war. And three, religion versus science. These are very highly topics of religions, and we understand each one. First of all, which is the least interesting, at least for me, is literalism. Is literalism been around since the beginning of religion, or is a new phenomenon? Many people who want to defend their specific religions, again, regardless which religion, denomination, theology, or version of theism they subscribe to, regardless of their political position, again, from left, right, center, doesn't matter. They're trying to justify that religion did not have a literalist interpretation or never have one in the beginning. This is historically inaccurate. In many cases, in many religions, when it was first founded, when it was in its early years, it did have a literalist approach. It did not have start to move away literalist until after the first generation of believers die off, right? For example, let's talk about Hinduism, which is the third largest religion in the world. The other two are Christianity, Islam. I'm gonna talk about those later. In many Vedic texts, it's been established in many Vedic theology that the Vedas are infallible. There are absolutes. So in many cases, according to their theology, you should have a literalist approach. But over time, when they better understand the other world and also changing culture, move away from a literalist interpretation to a metaphorical, political, psychoanalytical, hermeneutic, regardless. But like I said, every religion, when it first starts, takes a literalist approach and then over time move away when times change, and the people trying to stick with the literalist approach tend to be the extremists, the terrorists, the fundamentalists, and people on the far right in general. We cannot ignore the fact. And in many cases, we look at the Abrahamic religions, we have to start with Judaism. Judaism was originally a polytheistic religion, where they worship multiple gods, somewhere around 70 gods, and Yahweh, which would be the main god of the Abrahamic religion, was originally a minor god, a minor war god, until the Yahweh movement from the 1000 BC and beyond started to move away from polytheism to henotheism, where they worship one god but still, do not reject the existence of other gods. And it took another 700 years or so where this polytheistic religion truly becomes monotheism. And to give you a sample, when it actually became a monotheistic religion, Aristotle was still alive, to give you an example. And throughout history, many Jews believed their texts were literal. They was the literal word of God, and those things actually happened as historical events. And wasn't until when they synchronized to Hellenistic culture or Hellenistic Judaism, where they started to move away from the literalist approach and went to a more metaphorical, philosophical approach, more popular for Philo of Alexandria. And even then, those thinkers of the 2nd century CE, like I said, it took centuries, if not almost 1,000 years, in order to move away of a more literalist approach to a more metaphorical approach. And they started to deidize their prophets, like Moses as God. If you want to know more about examples of how Jewish prophets became gods, like how Christians view Jesus as God, I highly recommend the book How Jesus Became God by Bart Ehrman. It has an entire chapter about Jewish history, about how they did the same thing before Christianity. And like I said, Christianity was originally started from a Jewish sect of Jewish apocalypticism, where Jesus, a Jewish rabbi, a human prophet who believed the world was going to end during his lifetime, and many of these first generation Jewish Christians took their early gospel as literalists because they believed the world was going to end in their lifetimes. And when the first generation of Christians die off, including Paul, they had to move away from their apocalypticism and change their theology to original sin, salvation, the importance of the crucifixion, the Eucharist, and other things. And that's where till the 2nd to 3rd century, this is way after the foundation of Christianity, where they start to move away from the literalist approach, like Origen of Alexandria and Saint Augustine, trying to make a more metaphorical interpretation. The same thing goes with Islam, which was originally a Christian apocalyptic movement where Muhammad believed the world was going to end during his lifetime. And one of the more famous examples during his final years of his life, in his deathbed, where his followers were asking him, about when the world's gonna end, he pointed his two fingers, the middle finger and the ring finger, and it's like the distance between the point of each finger is how close the world's gonna end. If you don't know, to clarify, that means the century where Muhammad died, the 7th century, was meant to be the last century. The 7th century was to be the end time. So Muhammad died, the first followers of Islam died, and the world did not end. And was it till during the second caliph, we started to move away from this apocalypticism movement to a very different theology, to become Islam as we usually know it today. We have to remember all religions, especially the major religions, started with their view on text in a more literal approach, and was until after the first generation followers died off when they had to reinterpret their texts. Again, this is a very short one, so like I said, we're not gonna go into deep detail, but I summarize everything you need to know. Like I said, this is nothing new. Even the pagan religions around their time of their foundation was a very literalist approach. The intellectuals of those time period who did not accept the literal approach, but they were the minority. The majority of the believers believe in a literalist approach. They believe these things actually happen, and the words were literal, or these events happen exactly like I said. The majority of the followers, who were the common people, believe in the literalist approach, and only that few intellectuals, and like I said, these intellectuals appear way after the foundation of the religion, start to move away from the literalist approach. So people who said that their religion never have a literalist is considered heretical, or it considered doesn't make sense in the foundation. That's not true. We have historical accounts of them viewing in a literalist approach, and like I said, it wasn't till after the first generation of each of their respective religions die off till the second, third generation move away from the literalism. And for Christian literalism, the biblical literalism, it didn't revive, at least it became more mainstream, until the 20th century. But like I said, these 20th century followers and their first century counterparts are not so different when it comes to how they view scripture. Second, and this is the case, how does in fact war? For people trying to defend religion, they often argue that religion doesn't cause much of the violence, which is technically, for many studies has shown that religion causes a lot of violence, especially when it comes to racism, sexism, homophobia, ageism, how they view mentally impaired people, physically impaired people, stuff like that. Religion is the root cause of many of the discriminations, and many examples in their scripture, regardless of religion, point to these people who have physical impairments as negative, or as sin even, or as It shows you a sign. If you don't follow me, this is gonna happen to you. Again, this is like a form of discrimination for people who are not body able. And throughout time, when they're trying to justify their religion, regardless, again, I will repeat multiple times, regardless which version of religion, denomination, theology, or theism, they will point in a study paper about the religious violence that actually religion doesn't cause most of the violence, because this paper showed that only 6% of every single war, recorded war, was religious in nature. But the problem is, many people point out that even though this article is actually a really good article, there's something wrong with his conclusion that doesn't make sense. For example, how many wars were religious? We have to understand if it says that only 6.7 of all wars are religious. This has often been claimed by people trying to defend religion. Again, regardless if you're a Christian, a Muslim, a Jewish, a Hindu, a Buddhist, a pagan, doesn't matter, right? This is from a paper by Philip and Axel Lord's index list of 1,763 wars, but only listed 120 as wars as considered religious wars. But in the index, it says 121. But there are some multiple issues. A fundamental observation is that there is a reference cited by these people trying to defend their religion if they accept their work and their source, right? But after reading these articles in question, many people have pointed this out as well, how many people point out Steven Pinker's definition of violence. There's a problematic. When Steven Pinker, for example, said that before hierarchy and before the state, life was brutal and violent and short, when in reality every archaeologist would tell you that it was actually pretty peaceful, and living in an anarchist society was more beneficial than a hierarchical society, where before 12,000 years ago only 3% of every single death in the world was a violent death. And it wasn't until after hierarchy and early agriculture was established that 3% raised to 15%. And like I said, when people trying to say this paper about religion not the main cause of violence, or in this particular topic, war, reading by the paper itself, is said, and I quote, "For much of the world before 17th century, these reasons for war were explained and justified, at least for the participants, by religion." So they admitted that religion was a frequent justification of war, end quote. And it became great justification for, and I quote, "the objectives of warfare were broader from the conquest of this or that several kingdom to the spread of revolutionary ideals, and from these ideological backdoors, something like the fever of religious slipped back into war." And they emphasized the justification for religion as the cause of war. At the end, it was until World War II where we had the rise of religious fanaticism and ideologies. And it was until the early 21st century where basically everyone was exclusively ideological, and then more secular than purely religious. And like I said, the paper itself is not comprehensive. They acknowledge that this is not comprehensive. No matter how much we try to add the material, we will never truly complete it, right? So even they acknowledge this, but there is a Western bias in their paper when they rely on Western encyclopedias of warfare and not much of African or Eastern Asian, although they do talk about it, but they do not go as focused as Western, wars. So keep that in mind. Like for example, the longest war in history means a war that has a very long duration of time was the Reconquista, a war between Christians and Muslims in Iberia Peninsula, which lasted for 711 years. Although the war wasn't always violent, sometimes it was very peaceful with occasional fights, but there was a religious motivation behind it, and it was, like I said, the longest war in human history when it comes to length of time. And if we look at Steven Pinker's book, the Battle Angels of Our Nature, How Violence Has Been Declined, where he made a list of the top 20 most violent events in human history. Out of the top 10, number 9 is a religious war, the Taiping Rebellion. And another one in the top, again, the top 10 was the Atlantic slave trade and the East slave trade, also known as the Arabian slave trade, where they used religion as a justification in many cases. Like I said, I highly recommend the book Violent Evangelism in Latin America and The Church in Latin America. I recommend those two books, which they focus more on detail on how they use religion as a justification for the extermination of the Native Americans and the justification of slavery, and how early views of racism started with Islam and early Christian when they're trying to slave Africans. And also early eugenics was justified religiously originally. I highly recommend the book Infected Christianity. Also, capitalism, debatably, it has its origins in Islam when they did the Arab slave trade, and the earliest example of the, labor theory, not labor theory of value, but the capital, and their conception of it started in the 15th century by Muslims, slave traders, where it's very interesting. There are academic papers on the subject. They're very short, but I highly recommend it. But like I said about the paper, when people trying to defend their religions, they say only 6% of wars are religious wars. Like I said, many people point out their definition of wars were flawed, and the more accurate number is actually, and drum roll please, I guess, is 34.5%. 1/3 of every single recorded war was a religious war. If you don't know, the paper has a list of 1,770 distinct wars that are named, and like I said, 1/3 of them, or 617, are religious wars. 34.5%. At least that's regardless of which religion we talk about. This is in general, so we're not talking about Christian wars or Muslim wars or Hindu war. It's just religious in general, regardless what religion we're talking about. And people have break down, of this accurate number of all religion, which one caused the most religion. Many atheists falsely claim that 60% of all religious wars are Muslim wars, that Islam is the one that caused most wars. This is not actually true. Remember, this is shortly after 9/11, so they talk shit to Islam about everything, even if it doesn't make sense or is falsely inaccurate. But in reality, if we look at the perspective of these wars, Christianity caused the most wars. With, like I said, there are 617 religious wars, aka 1/3 of every single war. Out of 617 of them, 368 are Christians. Next will come Islam as the second, at 306 wars, and the third place are Buddhists with 30 wars. So technically speaking, Christianity caused 59% of all the religious wars. And I'm kind of surprised learning their analysis that Buddhism is the third place. I was expecting like various pagan religions or Hinduism even, but not Buddhism. Like I said, if you know about Buddhism involved with fascist Japan, and they were very pro-fascist, believing that Hirohito was the future Buddha, and they're going to spread Buddhism by the sword. Seriously, that was a thing. And the rise of violence against non-Buddhists in Thailand, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar, or Burma, depending on your pronunciations. So it shows you that not only that 1/3 of all wars were religious in nature, in fact, it's been on the rise since the year 500 AD. And remember, we're still having religious conflicts, big or small. Like if the ISIS conflict in Syria and Iran, the Israel-Palestinian conflict that's been around for half a century, and many people, many Jewish, or apartheid state use religion as a justification for the oppression of the Palestinian people. So So like I said, I already talked about two of these three things. And like I said, it's very important to understand that many people, religious or not religious, may talk about these things but do not analyze correctly whether or not these things true. Many atheists will say religion is the cause of all wars, which is not true. It is true factually that 1/3 of all wars are religion, but to say that the religion all wars are religions is completely false. The same thing with the believers who trying to justify that only 6% of all wars are religious, well, again, this is false. And like I said, both atheists and religious people need to understand better about the facts and do not become ideologically blind because you want to take that gotcha moment, you know. Now, people, the last topic I want to talk about, which is very important, is science versus religion. Many people, regardless if you're a believer or not, trying to defend the religion that there is no conflict between religion and science, right? This is false. There is a conflict, but many people who trying to make a case for the conflict, they realize a very outdated look of the conflict thesis by the 1800s, which has been debunked. But that doesn't mean that because of the thesis in question is false, doesn't mean therefore there is no conflict at all. This is completely wrong. There's always been a conflict, and like I said, many other religions, I will make a video in the future, that more specifically Christianity, but religion in general, usually is founded under the principles of anti-intellectualism in many other religions, right? So to say there is no conflict is false, and many people trying to defend the religion that is completely compatible, which again is false. And we purely on a philosophical basis, what is the foundation of the scientific method, and what methods they use, versus the foundation of religion, right? Is completely the opposite when it comes how we make our foundations. I highly recommend a book by Susan Haack, Defend the Science, which has a chapter about religion and science and how religion is incompatible with science, fundamentally speaking. If you don't know, it's not the entire book that is about the topic, is a specific chapter, and is, how do I say this correctly? It is pragmatist, and she is a pragmatist philosopher, right? So, if you're a big fan of pragmatism, you're gonna like this book, right? So, there's that. I recommend chapter 10, Point of Honor on Science and Religion. That's where the topic focus on. But I'm not gonna focus about that chapter of the book. We're going to focus about the science versus religion. A very good good academic paper by Bart Ehrman, who made a topic about the fundamental nature of the conflict. I quote, Introduction. It is commonly held that science and religion are in conflict. Most people are vaguely aware of the dispute between Galileo and the Catholic Church. More recent is the controversy about teaching evolution and creationism, especially in the United States. Even the secular country like the Netherlands, the year of Darwin in 2009, heated up a debate that many had thought to have already been settled. Prominent contemporary atheists has also argued that science and religion are in conflict, leaving religion with sort of end of the stick. Other intellectuals have contested this conflict thesis or warfare thesis. However, the opening quotation, I will say, more sophisticated believers and historians have objected that this conflict thesis or model has been supplanted, and that a lot of scientists, even top scientists, are religious. A prior example is Francis Colonial, a former head of the Human Genome Project and the current director of the National Institute of Health. Do these facts provide good ground to discard the conflict thesis? Several different questions should be distinguished in any discussion about the relationship between science and religion. Since different questions have different answers, nuances are often overlooked in discussion about the subject. There are issues concerning the history of the relationship between science and religion. I also recommend the book The Cambridge Companion of Religious Science, which talks about the overall historical development over time. There are also sociological, psychological, philosophical issues. All these subjects are complex and often oversimplified. This essay will deal with a number of different questions about the multifaceted relationship between science and religion. However, before we dive into all of that, we must first answer a different question. What do we mean by the notoriously difficult term science and religion? For the purpose of this essay, we can restrict religion to its doctrinal content. which mainly depends on the particular concept of God or gods and their supposed acts. The ritualistic ethical aspect of religion hardly plays a role in the present debate. Most religious people think God interacts with our world through revelation, miracle, answering prayers, etc. Such a personal God is often considered to have human traits, such as the ability to love, be wrathful, and act accordingly. This is classical theism, the standard view of God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and polytheistic religions have multiple gods that can interfere with our world, often with his or her own personal traits, example, Hinduism. Intervening and personal gods are central to all theistic religions, monotheistic and polytheistic. Theism should be distinguished from both deism and pantheism. On deism conception, God started the universe and let it run its own ever since, without intervening. This view of God was popular among the intellectuals during the Enlightenment, but has few adherents today. A deistic God would hardly be in conflict with science since it does not interfere with the natural world, with the exception of the creation part. On pantheistic, God is equate with the universe in the words of the philosopher Spinoza, that God or nature. Equating God with nature makes pantheism hard to distinguish from atheism. Pantheism often just seems to be a way of speaking about nature metaphorically. For example, Albert Einstein, who was an agnostic, once decried quantum mechanics with the famous phrase, God doesn't play with dice with the universe, and atheist cosmologist Stephen Hawking characterized our potential knowledge of the theory of everything as knowing the mind of God. Consequently, this aids would deal exclusively with the relationship between science and theism. Not only does the theistic view of God have the most adherents by far, but it's also the view that most of the fear from science, as will be argued below. For quite some time, philosophers of science have debated what is meant by the term science. For our purpose, two components of science need to be distinguished: its methodology as well as the body of knowledge generated by employing this methodology. The scientific method is simply referred to as systematic empirical testing of hypotheses. This includes historical claims, which cannot repeatedly be tested under controlled conditions, but can be made plausible when multiple lines of historical evidence converge. The body of knowledge refers to a highly coherent picture that the conjoined science gives us about reality for the communication between neurons of the structures of space-time. Two components of science can be viewed completely separate from the current body of knowledge, leads to new hypotheses, and background knowledge to place an important role in test claims. These essays argue that science and theistic religions are in conflict with each other. This conflict manifests itself in four different domains and levels: historical, sociological, philosophical, and philosophical. Historically, there is a conflict between the content of religious doctrine and the development body of scientific knowledge. The sociological conflict consists on the fact that scientists are significantly less religious than non-scientists, statistically speaking, and that the people of faith reject scientific findings on religious grounds. The psychological conflict lies on debunking effects of the coveted science of religion. Finally, the philosophical conflict arises from the science that has made the existence of God and deism in general improbable and impossible, philosophically speaking. The historical conflict. The conflict thesis, which has been around for quite some time, over 200 years at this point, it maintains that science and religion are continuing in conflict, and there are science ultimately turns out to be the winner. Whether there is a contest between them, according to this view, the scientists fight a heroic battle against religious establishment, since it is then forced to hold on to its own doctrine. This classic version of the conflict is originated by two books: The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science by John William Draper, published in 1874, and The History of the Warfare of Science and Theology in Christendom by Andrew Dixon White, published in 1896. The historical research in the past few decades, however, showed that the conflict thesis as put forth by Draper and White has oversimplified matters. There was no continuous conflict, and many scientists, include the classic view of Galileo, were themselves religious. They saw scientific inquiry as a way of studying God's creation. Should we therefore discard the conflict thesis entirely? According to many historians, liberal theologians, and religious scientists, we should, at the opening quotation, simplify. Christian philosopher K.D. James Clark also conclude that the myth of continual and irreversible difference between science and religion needs to be put a well-deserved final rest. In its classical form, the Draper-White variety, the conflict thesis should indeed be discarded, but from this we cannot conclude that religion has nothing to fear from religion. On this issue, it is important to separate the views of scientists themselves on the one hand and the implication of their work on the other. Like for example, as an anarchist, we can only acknowledge that Mikhail Bakunin has a very important contribution to anarchist theory, But that doesn't mean we're anti-Semitic because Bakunin was an anti-Semite. Okay? It is undeniable that many scientists have been religious in the past centuries as well as today, and therefore saw no conflict between science and their former religion themselves. This does not mean, however, that their scientific findings were free from conflict with the prevailing religious doctrines. The conflict is rather to be found in the content of religious doctrine, which became undeniable in the light of scientific development. Let me illustrate. Like, for example, ancient Greek philosophers and physicians in the tradition of Hippocrates had already started to attribute phenomena like earthquake, lightning, and many diseases to natural causes instead of gods. Similarly, the 1st century AD Roman thinker Lucius Seneca thought that these kinds of phenomena were not produced by angry gods but by natural causes. Or the Pythagoreans, who came up with the concept of irrational numbers, the code basically killed them because they could not believe a rational number exists and goes against their religion that the entire universe is rational. This contrasts sharply with many biblical stories in which misfortunes are seen as a punishment from God. Nevertheless, during the Middle Ages, Christian thinkers will often look for natural causes of phenomena, so-called secondary causes, which they believed that God could interfere directly as a primary cause. Serious inquiry into natural causes gained momentum in the 16th and 17th century. Most famous example is Galileo Galilei. Though himself a Christian, Galileo clearly distinguished nature from scripture and insisted that one should be led by observation in discussion about nature. His intellectual predecessor, Nicholas Copernicus, was reapproached by the famous theological reformer Martin Luther for putting forward ideas that conflict with scripture. Copernicus and Galileo not only undermined the authority of the Bible, but also prevailing worldview that the earth is the center of the universe. This geocentrism was astronomical notion, but one with major philosophical implications. It is a part of the traditional Christian and also Jewish and Muslim worldview in which human take place position, anthropocentrism. The circular movements of the heavenly bodies in the firmament declare the creation of God's handiwork. Geocentrism is also aligned with the Bible, which states that the earth does not move. For example, 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verse 30 or Psalms chapter 93 verse 1, and that God sees the sun and the moon to stand still in Job chapter 10 verse 12 to 13. Not the earth, as Luther reapproached Copernicus, even held by Christians localized at the center of the earth, and even Christians in the 1st century believed that demons live in the moon. First away from heaven became problematic in light of the new heliocentrism. When Copernicus and Galileo started to undermine the prevailing geocentrism, even these religious ideas were brought under dispute. The trial of Galileo is historically complex, a point that is often used as an argument against the idea there is a real conflict between science and religion. As noted earlier, Galileo was a religious man, and the empirical grounds for his view were not strong early as they would later become. Moreover, there were conflicts at a personal level. Luther's Protestant Reformation made the Catholic Church more stringently doctrinally. Galileo's view also conflicted with the prevailing Aristotelianism of the time. The Inquisition judged Galileo's views to be foolish and absurd in philosophy, but also firmly heretical as it explicitly contradicted in many places sense of the Holy Scripture according to the literal meaning of the words and according to the common interpretation and understanding of the Holy Father and the doctors of theology. This last part of the verdict is especially interesting, for it grounds the rejected heliocentrism explicitly on Bible and Christian theological tradition and, like I said earlier, a literalist approach of cosmology. Galileo was allowed to consider his idea as merely hypothetical, but he did not confirm this restriction, where resulted in his famous trial. The verdict clearly states that Galileo's transgression having held and believed a doctrine that is false and contrary to divine and holy scripture. Galileo was kept under house arrest until his death and was compelled to renounce his heliocentrist statements. He did not go to jail, but his intellectual imprisonment is abject and had to be terrible, especially for a scientist. During this time, the idea that nature is covered by natural laws, secondary causes, instead of direct divine intervention, primary causes, became more and more common in the scientific circles, for the scientific picture had become mechanistic. The French Catholic philosopher René Descartes developed the idea that the entire universe consists of entire circular moving particles, and even speculated about how natural laws could give rise to the solar system. The British physicist Isaac Newton provided another similar mechanistic theory about the workings of the solar system. Newton, also a religious person, albeit very orthodox, a mix of Christianity, deism, and occultism. To his mind, the natural workings of the solar system required a divine designer and needed God to interfere from time to time to maintain his stability. Later scientific development by Pierre Samuel Leblanc and others showed that God's intervention was not necessary to account for the origin and stability of the solar system. This led to the famous attribution by Leblanc in response to Napoleon Bonaparte about the question of God, that I had no need of that hypothesis. In other fields of knowledge, appears to the supernatural explanation also started to decline throughout the 17th century. More and more doctors provide natural accounts of medical disorders, though epidemics and madness were still ascribed to supernatural forces because their actual causes remain unknown. Epidemics and plague, for example, were still regarded as punishment from God. In 1721, the government of Massachusetts called for fasting and remorse because of the imminent epidemic by a Puritan secretary saw more good in vaccination, which was then still in its infancy. Around the same time, lightning strike was still seen by many people as divine punishment, but this belief gradually eroded away when lightning rods proved to be very effective in averting the supposed penalty from God. The last two examples I will mention concern development in geology during the 18th and early 19th century, as well as Darwin's theory of evolution. The history of the Earth and biblical thought were discussed in great deal during the 17th century, but new scientific development not only showed that the Earth was much older than previously thought, but like I said, because even Jews very back then, before they moved away from the literalist movement, believed in young Earth creationism. But also the humans were not created separate from non-human animals. On the contrary, the evidence strongly suggests that slow, wasteful, and blind evolutionary mechanisms produce humankind, not direct creation by a perfectly good and all-powerful God. One could hardly deny that these developments have philosophical implications. Furthermore, they create doubts about theological matters like the historicity of Adam and Eve and the fall. And every historian agrees that every single biblical event before King David did not happen. These implications were apparently strong enough to compel Pope Pius XI to state explicitly in his Encyclopedia on Human Origin that all human descendants that are from even Adam and Eve. Again, religious doctrines were contested by scientific development. The biblical story of creation pretend to describe historical reality, but those stories turn out to be false. Even the great church father St. Augustine often considered Africa reading the biblical allegory, confirmed his belief that Genesis also contained history. He explicitly denied that Genesis should only be read allegory, yet discussed the issue that still considered creationists to this day. The only person before Augustine who completely abandoned the literalist approach of creation was Origen of Alexandria, but like I said, he was considered a heretic by most Christians. Even a religious concept as central as the idea of a soul has been made unattainable by recent development in psychology and neuroscience. I recommend the book the Mortal Brain and The Myth of the Afterlife. Those are good books that discuss why the very concept of a non-physical mind, like the soul, cannot and will not exist. The scientific development outlined above clearly demonstrated the last three things. First, they contravene biblical authority. The Bible turns out to be wrong about our place in the universe, the age of the earth, the flood, and the creation of mankind. Again, this also happens to all religion when they have their scripture. The reason we focus about Christianity and Islam because they're the two biggest religions that compromise almost half of the population in the world. Believe this in some shape or form, forcing intellectuals to put their trust in observation and experiment over revelation, at least in matters concerning astronomy, geology, and biology. Second, they show that scientific development clearly have philosophical religious implications. Both Galileo, heliocentrism, and Darwin's theory of evolution changed irreversibly by the tradition of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and other religions there about humankind's place in the universe. The view that science and religion are completely separate and simplified by Stephen Jay Gould in the non-overlapping Magisterium is therefore undeniable, unattainable. Finally, science has historically had a naturalized tendency. Naturalist explanation provides the development science had debunked or made superior previously held supernatural explanations provided by religion. One could say that science desupernaturalizes and provides a coherent naturalistic big picture of the universe. In sum, scientific development, when they were brought to us primarily by religious scholars, had led to a doctrinal drawback of religion. The role of God as a designer and governor of the world has been increasingly reduced over time. While religious proponents will speak to dialogue between science and religion with respect to religious doctrine, there's only been a monologue, one in favor of science, and over time there's a reason, at least in academia, if you want to study theology professionally, there's a reason the majority now hold a postmodern theology, moving away from the supernatural approach and going to like pantheism, pantheism approach, a very postmodern approach. They still believe something outside the physical, spatial, temporal world, but in a very minimal sense. The sociological conflict. Other questions about the relationship between science and religion are sociological. Why do people and scientists in particular think about religion? What do they think about science and religion relate? If science and religion can coexist peacefully, we might expect scientists to be as religious or non-religious as non-scientists. But sociological data clearly show otherwise. Scientists are significantly less religious than the general population, especially where they are top of their fields. Edward Larson and Larry Windham, as members of the National Academy of Science, the scientific elite, if they believe in a personal God, or subscribe to deism in general. In 1998, only 7% of these members uh, believe in God in any form, and in 1914 that was 28%. And the non-deistic 21 were, and I think 72 were atheists. Even less religious are the top evolutionary biologists Greg Griffin and William Provence, show of the only 4.7% of the evolutionary biologists of the National Academy of Sciences and that identify as theists, where 78% they consider themselves to be naturalists, those who disbelieve anything supernatural. Quicker and more detailed research being done by Elliot Eklund will focus on scientists from major American university, reputable scientists, but not all members. Again, there was a considerable difference in the view of these scientists compared to non-scientists, albeit a smaller one compared to that only of the what's considered the elites. On these reputable scientists, 64% of atheists or agnostic compared to only 6% of non-scientists, where 63% of non-scientists did not doubt God's existence, or only 5% reputable scientists had that same stance. Evangelical Christian was particularly unpopular among scientists. Only 2% of them identified with it, compared to the sizable 28% of the American population. Furthermore, the believing scientists have rather liberal religious belief. Another 15% of the scientists say they have a religious identity even though they do not believe in God, with 75% of the Jewish scientists being atheists or atheistic. It would be interesting to know why scientists as a whole are far less religious than the general population. Eklund analyzed contributing factors on the basis of the in-depth interviews. Apart from practicing science itself, she listed bad experience with religion, the probable evil/suffering, the lack of interest, or having a secular upbringing. These factors are not unique to scientists, however, and thus could account for unbelief in anyone. Her list of factors, therefore, does not seem to provide a plausible explanation for the non-belief of scientists per se, but Eklund provides no further discussion. A plausible explanation, nevertheless easy to fathom. Scientists typically have more analytical thinking skills, which tend to enhance religious skepticism and disbelief. And recent survey on philosophers that, over 60% were atheists. Another sociological question concerns the extent to which science is rejected by the faithful, as well as why they rejected it. If science and religion are really in harmony, one should not expect to see large differences in the acceptance of science by believers when compared to non-believers. Again, the data show otherwise. Poll consistently showed that 45% of the American population hold some form of creationist belief. In 2010, David Wilson found that only in the whole world, 59% of Christians were creationists, while only 7% accept natural evolution. And studies show about the professionally trained academic theologians that only 7 or 12% believe in evidentialism. Basically, the majority of academic trained theologians, at least Christian ones, reject evidence-based epistemology. Interesting, the creation started to the main reason for rejecting evolution was not the alleged lack of evidence for it, but was religious, due to literal reading of Genesis, or because evolution undermines the doctrine of being created in God's image. Wilson also looked at why atheists reject the existence of God. Their answers may cite the lack of evidence for God, as well as the perception of the scripture conflicted with science, which they also found that Christians were certain about their beliefs than the atheists were, implying less skepticism on the part of the Christians in this survey. But this also implies to other religions. In Islam, to this day, many people still believe that earthquakes, and many followers of Islam believe that earthquakes are caused by God's anger. The rejection of evolution is not only a Christian problem. Salma Hamid reported that only 8 to 20% of Muslims he surveyed accepted the theory of evolution. Human evolution is particularly controversial among them. Hamid also reported that out of the 18 Pakistani science teachers of 15 of them reject human evolution. They nonetheless believe that there is no conflict between science and Islam. The low acceptance of evolution is confirmed for Muslim students too, and to a lesser extent Muslim science teachers. According to data from the World Value Survey, Muslims from countries like Pakistan, Egypt, Morocco, and Qatar strongly agree with the statement whatever science and religion conflict, religion is always right. From 65 to 98% of the people said agree with this statement. This data, Christian Muslim view about evolution, not only showed that evolution is rightly rejected, but also that this rejection has religious roots. There is a clear correlation between the rejection of evolution and belief in God. Lesia Rizzo, Sarah Duncan, and Nicholas Caruso found that religiosity rather than education best explains students' views on evolution. Morally, nearly 2/3 of Americans say they will continue to hold certain religious beliefs even if they were rejected by science. Of course, not all religious people are reluctant to accept scientific findings. Religious scientists and liberal theologians often have no problem with, for example, evolution, or it seems. The evangelical geneticists Francis Collett and Pope John Paul II are often paraded as thinkers who accepted both evolution and their religion. These are religious intellectuals are sometimes put on display as evidence against the conflict of religion and science, or theism and science. However, neither Colin nor Pope John Paul II accept evolution without qualification when they argue that our moral and mental faculty could not have evolved naturalistically. Evolutionary biologists, by contrast, understand evolution to be a natural and indirect process that also creates our moral and mental faculties, regardless whether believers who accept evolution see it this way. Furthermore, they do not represent the believer population, as shown by the data above. Finally, these examples of apparent harmony only show that science and religion can both be accepted by the same person, not that science and religion are philosophically consistent. We will discuss later. The fact that some modern doctors describe homeopathic remedy wholly suggests that homeopathy and modern medicine are inconsistent. In sum, the scientists are less religious than the non-scientists, and more so if they are eminent. There is also a clear correlation between religiosity and the rejection of evolution. The evidence shows that religious impedance the acceptance of scientific facts. All this suggests there is a conflict between science and religion on a sociological level. Psychological conflict. The following field of cognitive science or religion, which includes anthropologists, psychologists, and neuroscientists, claim to account for the psychological roots of religion in a scientific and naturalistic way. Though it is very young, the field has put forth several different hypotheses for understanding certain aspects of religion. In strictly logical sense, explaining religion in a naturalistic way does not exclude supernatural origin for any religion. Any argument that particular religion claims are false because they have psychological explanation committed a genetic fallacy. Nevertheless, one can take a legitimate probabilistic argument that naturalistic explanation not only renders supernatural accounts superfluous but improbable. The CSR does have debunked the effect on religious claim. The core issue here is the causal mechanism used to explain religion. Traditionally, mechanism is assumed to be divine, the inspirational properties of Holy Scripture, or direct communication with believers through answered prayers or hearing or seeing God or holy figures, etc. Religious experience and revelation are sometimes even used in formal arguments for the existence of God. If divine causes can be shown to not only unnecessarily but less probable than purely naturalistic explanation, that this will be undermine any claim to religious supernatural origin. If there is no causal connection with the divine, directly or indirectly, then religion is just as natural a phenomenon as painting or cooking, and so cannot credibly be used as an argument for the existence of God. The CSR, the kind of science of religion, research has shown that religious belief can be explained by natural cognitive mechanisms. Such mechanisms include anthropomorphizing tendencies, projecting human-like characters to non-human things, propensity towards mind-body dualism, the belief that mind so exists independently of the body/brains, teleological thinking, projecting purposes to non-purposeful phenomenon, and mentalizing, ascribing minds or supernatural entity in order to communicate with them. These natural mechanism bias is to find the existence of supernatural entities, gods, angels, demons, spirits, etc. intuitively compelled, even though belief in them is not virtually justified. It turns out that believers indeed have a more intuitive thinking skill, and where disbelief have more analytical, rational questioning thinking skill. Furthermore, spiritual experience that were long seen as clearly supernatural, such as near-death experience or out-of-body experience, can now, at least partially, be explained naturalistically as complex and profound hallucinations. These natural mechanisms not only make supernatural explanations superfluous, but also fits well with our background knowledge of how the universe works, which paints a picture in which supernatural interference simply plays no role. Furthermore, these naturalistic account religion have greater parsimony because one doesn't have to invoke special plea to maintain the Christian further doctrines because of the one true God revealed those doctrines to them, where non-Christian believers affirm different doctrines due to the sort of naturalistic mechanism that CSR investigate. Naturalistic account of religion also have a greater explanatory power because they don't require anyone to posit any ad hoc hypothesis such as sensitivitas or the sense of the divine. Also important to note that naturalistic explanation could have utterly failed to explain religion, and there could have been evidence for the supernatural interference when particular prophets spoke or particular believers prayed. This could also be evidence for the existence of brainless minds or souls leaving the deceased body, but of course there is none. Debunking effects of naturalistic explanation of religion, especially as part of a larger naturalistic picture on supernatural accounts, can be seen as a conflict between science and religion on a psychological level. Lastly, we have the philosophical conflict between theism and science, which made the existence of God not only improbable but impossible. And according to commonly held view, this is impossible because science cannot say anything about the existence of either God or the supernatural in general. The natural Colonial astronomers, for example, maintain this position. This holds the science is strictly methodological naturalism. That is, the science can only work with natural causes and explanation. As a supernatural being, God would thus outside the domain of science by definition. There are multiple problems with this view, but I will restrict my comment to the supposed interaction of God with the world. If divine action occurs, evidence of it could and should be there, and the absence of such evidence does render the existence of God improbable. It is important to remember that under classical theism, God is not only able to interact with our natural world, but actually does so. If God himself transcends this world completely, his actions on this world have empirical consequence. According to Jewish and Christian scriptures, and even Muslim scriptures, and Hindus and Buddhist scriptures as well. For example, God created the world, destroyed it in the flood, set plagues upon the Egyptian empire, led the Jewish people out of Egypt through the desert, the Exodus, to conquer Canaan, and so on. All this should have left massive amount of evidence, yet there is none. Despite decades of relevant intensive research, according to New Testament, Jesus was born of a virgin, which was based off a previous Zoroastrian belief that they believe the Messiah will be born of a virgin as well. So virgin births are not original to Christianity. It was actually a Mediterranean phenomenon, but many atheists falsely use this argument as like, they took it from pagan idea because we can see it everywhere outside of the Mediterranean world. No, it is exclusively a Mediterranean phenomenon, especially and also the dying and rising type of gods as well, which many scholars agree is a Mediterranean phenomenon. But many atheists trying to employ this concept outside of the region, which many religious beliefs accurately point out why it's wrong. And Jesus walked on water, turned water into wine, and was resurrected from the dead. The crucifixion is said to have been accompanied by hours of darkness during daytime and earthquake and the resurrection of saints. Again, though there is no extra biblical evidence to corroborate any of these stories, what there easily could have been, like for example Josephus, The oldest extra biblical text, which is a Jewish text by the historian Josephus, calls Jesus Ben Ananis, and Jesus son of Damascus, who was a rabbi and appointed high priest by King Agrippa. He was just a human prophet, so there's that. All of these miracles had to break the natural order in a way that would have been noticed by many people and thus should have been empirically detectable. This puts all such miracle claims in the domain of science, at least the principle they could, and in some cases should have been evidence of God's miraculous intervention in history, yet in fact there is none. Apparently the legendary biblical days of unequivocal manifestation of the divine in this world are over. The same point could be made about prayer. Millions of believers expect God to answer their prayer. They ask God to cure the sick, for example, or form an intercessory prayer. Millions of ill Christians still go on annual pilgrimages to France and hope that by doing so, God will cure them. And since those of miraculous healing abound, but God really does cure people, one ought to be able to demonstrate statistically significant effects from engaging in distant prayer. No such effect has ever been demonstrated, however, not for want to trying. Research in the effect of intercessory prayer being published in renowned scientific journals, although such research has shown that prayer does not produce any effect, and had there been an effect, it would have been demonstrably scientific. As such, it can not be ascribed to methodological error. It was replicated by other researchers, and the implication would be overwhelming. Not only would the believer have good evidence for the efficiency of prayer, but the data would have been very hard to explain naturalistically. Presumably, doctors will even put the prescribed prayers since their recommendation will be evidence-based. A final potential case could be made for creationism. If all the astronomical, geological, and biological evidence had confirmed the biblical story about creation and the flood, we will have good evidence for God's interference, but the truth of the Bible and against naturalism. And this also applied again to Hinduism, Buddhism, and all other religions that also have similar accounts, but in fact these stories turn out to be historically accurate and are precisely the kinds of stories one would expect from people without accurate knowledge about the universe and its history. The actual history of the universe does not betray any evidence of divine intervention, even though it could have done so. The example I mentioned above make one point very clear. There could and in some cases should have been evidence of God's interaction with our world, but there is none. Martin Baudry, Steve Blackmore, and Joseph Brackman therefore rightly conclude supernatural claims do not fall beyond the reach of science. They have simply failed. One could object that God moves in mysterious ways, or in ways that seem to be naturalistic or actually supernatural, or that God will not perform miracles to prove skeptics wrong. But this is simply an immunization strategy, typically used by pseudoscientists and conspiracy theorists. Nice recently defense. One could also object that God is not a scientific hypothesis to be tested, but has treated God as a hypothesis indeed theological, psychological, inappropriate, or even absurd, but philosophically is not. For religion make epistemological and factual claims that can be tested empirically. When these claims can be refuted, it is just to tentatively conclude there is no God interacting with our world. The science had given us a naturalistic account of the world. Matter, energy is ordered in certain patterns, natural law in space-time. Purportedly, supernatural events, one omnipresent human explanation, turn out to be natural or non-existent. The rational believer who has true strategy for saying the theistic interacting God first to look further for good evidence of divine intervention. Creationists, including the intelligent design proponent, have been trying this for decades but without producing any conceivable result. Experimenting involving intercessory prayer also exemplified this strategy, though likewise without producing the hoped for results. The consistent failure of strategy is therefore discouraging. The other strategy is to argue that God does not directly intervene in the natural order, but this is one behind the natural order. In this view, God did not create the world in a direct supernatural way as the biblical narrative, but in an indirect natural way via natural evolution, as proposed by the theologian John Haack. The problem with this strategy is that we have no good reason to think God is behind the natural causal events as an extra entity overdetermining them. Such overdetermination is logically possible, of course, but if the view that Greek god Poseidon caused the earthquake via plate tectonics, both ideas possess explanatory unnecessary entities that can be dismissed with Occam's razor. Therefore, the strategy does not seem particularly promising either. Could the rational believer reside in other ways of knowing besides science? Traditionally, revelations handed down by prophets, the experience of individual believers in prayer or in visual religious operation, in sacred scripture have been used as a substitute for empirical knowledge, but they turn out to be an epistemological catastrophe. Believers in different religions make different and often contradictory claims based on their alleged revelation. The polytheistic beliefs and revelation contradict those of monotheists. The notion of reincarnation based on karma contradicts the notion of eternal afterlife based on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. According to the Bible, Jesus is the Son of God, but according to the Quran, he is not. Not only are religious such contradictions, but there is no defense or procedure for deciding between them, making religious dispute unreasonable. In fact, science has often invalidated the Bible and the Quran and the Vedas and the Pali Canon, etc., in those places where it can be tested, further undermining its reliability. Historical research also showed that Gospels are historically unreliable. This contrasts sharply with science, which is able to validate its method source and has provided us with great deal of reliable knowledge as well as many practical implications. While caught up in the minutiae of detailed theistic arguments and claims, the general trend is too easily overlooked. The supernatural has historically given way to the natural. Before the scientific revolution, the origin world was held to be supernatural, according to the Bible. Disease and misfortune were result of the supernatural causes. The Bible was held to be more or less infallible revelation from God, and these stories in the general taken to be historical. Divine intervention was hardly accepted. All these changes so radically in the past few centuries because of science. No scientific discipline appeals to the supernatural explanation and cause any more, because all previous supernatural explanations had turned out to be false or not fruitful. Cosmology, astronomy, geology, biology, neuroscience, psychology has shown that our origins are natural. Supernatural stories have been superseded. This is the most profound conflict between science and religion. The simplistic naive version of the science-religion conflict thesis is historically false and has indeed been superseded, but it is untrue to the version presented here. I show the science-religion conflict in at least in 4 different domains. The historical, the doctrinal controversy become less and less tenable as science progressive. The sociological, where scientists are much less religious than non-scientists. Religious belief offer reject scientific findings on religious grounds. The psychological evidence in covenant science or religion have undermined the tenability of supernatural accounts of religion. And finally, the discovery of science has made the existence of God and all religious claims improbable, while religion's ways of knowing are independently highly problematic on their own. Science paints a naturalistic picture of the world at the expense of the supernatural, leaving religion much to fear from scientific progress. The believers who want to take science seriously had to dismiss religious claims about factual matters, concede that science has made classical theism unattainable.